Chapter 36. Tidus blinked back into existence and found Magina Perrin grinning at him. The two of them were standing at the edge of the room, hands wrapped and ready to spar. The pain in his neck was like a claw, twisting between the vertebrae. "Welcome back," Magina said. "Ready for round 2? "We're about to find out," Tidus said. Magina threw her head back and laughed, and Tidus followed her back to the center of the room. Don't overthink it. Don't have a plan. It was time to let his instincts take over. Tidus pulled up foresight and let the tingly feeling of the flow of time run under his skin. He let it dance along his limbs and turned his focus to Magina. She lunged at him again, an almost identical move to the first time, and foresight gave him the warning he needed to dodge. Tidus forced himself not to think, not to plan. He just moved. His heart pounded, pushing adrenaline through his veins, and the energy of time increased, like a hum growing louder in his ears. Magina lunged once more, laughing maniacally, and Tidus raised an arm to block. On impact, the world around him splintered, like the very air had turned to panels of glass, like the fractured reflection of a broken mirror, but every version was just slightly different. He had seen this happen before on a smaller scale. Helix used it to make devastating attacks. Tidus had only managed it on accident before. He ascertained a slice of possibility where he managed to avoid Magina's attack and grabbed onto it until it filled his view and became reality. He dodged Magina's assault and found himself standing behind her. He raised his elbow to strike at the small of her back. Magina ducked so low she supported herself on her hands and swept his legs out from under him with a swinging kick. Tidus fell. He tried to grab onto another fractured reality, but before he could clasp onto one or even hit the ground, Magina's feet hit him squarely in the chest and redirected his descent so he slammed into the wall instead. His head hit the stone with a hard crack, and Tidus woke up gasping in the timescape. His entire skull screamed with pain, like it was still shattering into pieces, but in slow motion. Tidus groaned and blinked the pain spots away from his vision. Not Tidus wasn't here. Tidus got to his feet, swaying with the pain of having his skull cracked open. His neck throbbed sympathetically. He had gotten farther this time at least, and the way reality had fractured around him like glass made his heart race. Tidus walked forward until the strangely still not sea appeared, and he walked in. Inhaling the water was still a suffocating feeling, but it was becoming easier every time. Tidus wasn't sure how to feel about that. He blinked and came to, standing at the edge of the room, facing Magina Perrin, hands freshly wrapped for the sparring match. The pain of 2 deaths shot through him at once, supernovas of pain in his neck and skull. Tidus doubled over and vomited. Magina stepped back to avoid the splash and clicked her tongue. "Progress," she said, "but that's as much as I'm going to put up with today. Schedule me for when you think you're ready to try again." "Our time isn't up," Tidus objected, wiping his mouth. "I can keep going." "Right answer," Magina said, "but still, no. If I kill you too often, too quickly, I'll just break your brain entirely. As much fun as that sounds, it doesn't quite align with the will of the Emperor. Go fix your brain." Magina punched him on the shoulder, mostly good-naturedly, but it still sent a shock of pain through Tidus. The jostling exacerbated the death pains that still rippled under the surface. Tidus retched and vomited again. "Timothy," Tidus groaned once the convulsions in his stomach subsided. "Send some cleaners in here, please." "They're already on the way," Timothy's voice responded. On a related note, I recommend a shower. Thanks, Tidus said, rolling his eyes. Tidus' head started spinning in the time the shower left him to think over the events of the day. He tried to grasp what had happened, what he had uncovered when reality had shattered around him. He tried to remember how it felt, to be able to recreate it at will. But that just brought the pain of his shattered skull flaring back to life. He felt Dasha coming just before she entered his room. "You look like someone who desperately needs to be distracted," she said, tilting her head to the side. Tidus almost shook his head, but stopped himself. He hated the advice to stop thinking, but he had asked for the training. He had to improve, no matter how difficult it was. Maybe it had only left him off balance and sick because he had resisted it, because he wasn't committed to it. Yes, this could be just what he needed. To practice, to not think. The pain of the 2 deaths of the day faded behind the heat of Dasha's body. The smell of sandalwood and sulfur in her hair, the taste of salt on her skin. His heart pounded, and tension bled out of his muscles. Dasha wrapped her tail around his ankle and pressed her fingers through his hair. Tidus pulled her closer. If he let himself stop thinking, it was easy. If he just let go, just let instinct take over. Even his awareness with time sense shattered around him, dissolving into a shower like a vortex of glitter. No thought, no planning, only sensation. Tidus lay in his bed, tangled with Dasha and the sheets. She snored into his shoulder, body curled against him. Realization washed over him in waves, like lying on the shore of a beach as the tide rolled in. Of course, he could never grasp how he had splintered time into panes of glass or selected a reality. He could never intellectually attain the pinnacle of timecasting's power, because it wasn't an academic discipline. It was infused into his being, into his very soul. The apex of timecasting was sensation. It was the purest, simplest, and most complex aspect of the entire scope of the power. Time was everything, everywhere. So easy to get lost in, so easy to drown in. You had to be strong enough to withstand the current, or you would be swept away. "Your 4th trial is next week, right?" Helix said, catching Tidus in the hall. He turned and met his gaze. The air between them was awkward and tense. Tidus could feel Helix's timecasting power reaching out, coming just short of forging a connection directly with Tidus' mind. They hadn't spoken in weeks. Tidus nodded wordlessly. Disappointment flashed across Helix's eyes, but he hid it quickly, adopting his usual relaxed posture. Only the flicking of his tail gave him away, and Tidus doubted anyone else would be able to tell. This entire thing reminded him of back when they had first met, when Helix had doggedly followed Tidus around until he had granted him a conversation. Helix was just the same as back then. Everything else was different. Tidus was different. "Mine too," Helix said. 2 days before yours, I think. You nervous?" "I'm prepared," Tidus replied shortly. He was nervous, but he couldn't admit that out loud. Not to Helix. If he did that, he wouldn't be able to hold back everything else. That much was still true. Once he started to talk to Helix, really talk, it was almost impossible to stop. "Sure," Helix said, his shoulders sagging. "Good luck then. See you on the other side." Helix turned and slinked around the corner, the tip of his tail disappearing with a final swish. Tidus bit his tongue to keep from calling after his one-time confidant, and forced his feet to turn around and carry him the other way. He was too close to the fourth trial to get caught up in any stupid friendships. He couldn't worry about Helix and whether he would survive. He had to worry about himself. Dasha understood that much. What they had was nothing, just stress relief, a way to blow off steam. It was meaningless, ultimately. That's what made it safe. There was no relationship he could have with Helix that wasn't incredibly dangerous. Chapter 37. Tidus woke early the day of the fourth trial, staring at the ceiling, his skin tingling like he was covered with thousands of crawling insects. Eventually, he couldn't take it anymore and got into the shower, scrubbing vigorously to get rid of the phantom insect feeling. He needed to be prepared and focused when he stepped into the arena to face the Void Shifter. The fourth trial was the least likely so far to be targeted by the assassins, since it took place in the cathedral itself. And of course, it was the deadliest trial yet, so there probably wasn't much practical use in sabotaging it anyway. Still, the question of when the assassin would next show their face haunted him. Tidus put on a thickly padded combat suit with heavy boots. The weight of it was comforting, but he knew it wouldn't keep him alive if he let his guard down for even a moment. He closed his eyes, standing in a strict parade rest with his arms clasped loosely behind his back. He breathed deeply and let his mind work entirely off the information provided by the time particles, just like when he had blindfolded himself for days on end to learn time sense. If he was going to be in top form for the trial, he would need the strongest connection possible to the flow of time. He could afford no distractions, no doubts. Even more so for the other trials, this one would be watched. Any Timecasters who had passed the fourth trial could observe if they wanted. His every move would be open to scrutiny. He could not even afford the appearance of a mistake. With observers, the fourth trial became not just a fight for his life, but a performance as well. Tidus made his way to the north wing as the time approached, and was greeted by a pearly-eyed savant. They bowed low, then led him down a hall that sloped downward, and brought them to the arena door. It was twice his height, and carved with intricate, interlocking runes. The most complex time-casting mandalas Tidus had ever seen. The trial arena was a massive hexagonal room, with the arena floor sunk down to allow for sparse spectator seating around the edges. Tidus could feel it with time sense just beyond the door. He narrowed his focus so he wouldn't be able to tell who was watching. He had avoided news of the results of the others' trials, of who had lived and who had died. He couldn't afford to waste any energy on the emotions that might come with that information. The door in front of him raised from the ground at the same time another door slid down from the ceiling behind him, like an airlock, preventing the chance of anything getting out of the arena. The savant had vanished. Tidus took a deep breath and stepped out into the light of the arena. Across the room from him, another door opened. It was similar to his door, but inverted, like a photograph in negative. The Void Shifter lurked behind the threshold, its signature sharp and distinct. Just like the door, it was familiar, but wrong, like the signature of a Timecaster had been turned inside out. Tidus clenched his fists, fighting back cold spikes of fear. Zion's words chipped away at the back of his focus. Mortality rates didn't matter. Statistics dealt with large sets of data. Tidus was one person. Statistics couldn't dictate his fate. The Void Shifter started moving. Tidus felt it like a ripple in a pond, rushing at him through the flow of time. He let go of all of his planning. Now it was time to let his instincts take over. If a dozen deaths at the hands of Magina had taught him anything, it was when to stop thinking to stay alive. The void shifter was invisible. Tidus closed his eyes and focused. It could hide from basic time sense, just like Dasha, but Tidus had learned to see past that. He didn't need the time signature. He could feel its movements through the time around it. The details were enough for him to pinpoint it. Dark and corrosive, even with only the faint impression of it he could pick up. It crawled towards him erratically. Even the way it moved carried an air of wrongness. It made Tidus sick to his stomach. He dodged to the side, and the creature melted back into visibility. It towered over him on spindly legs like a spider, but its upper half twisted into something lizard-like. It was covered in a shiny black carapace, and its head was completely eyeless, but it had eyes, dozens of them, all watching him. Pustule-like and pulsing, red eyes bulged out from between the plates of its armor, and the shoulder and the joints of its limbs. Tidus gripped the hilt of his dagger and leapt to the side. At that same moment, the shifter launched a sticky, elastic, barbed tongue towards him, purple and dripping with white slime. It kicked up a cloud of dirt and a spray of saliva when it hit the space he had just occupied. Flecks of saliva splashed onto his armor, sizzling on impact with an acrid smell. The tongue retracted, and the shifter let out a high, rattling cry. Its mouth gaped wide, jam-packed with fangs that oozed the sickly white saliva down its chin, dripping onto the arena floor. A rattling, gravelly voice came from the void shifter as it turned its eyeless head towards Tidus.
"Foolish little Timecaster,"
it hissed.
"Do what we both know you should. Lay down your weapon and atone for your sins. You are not the one who deserved to live."
Tidus' lungs constricted at the words. The truth of them dug into his heart. The bulbous red eyes glinted in Tidus' direction. They had no pupils, no irises, no physical structures required for sight. Tidus knew with a certainty in his gut that it could see him the same way he could see it, even when it turned invisible. Those eyes were keyed in directly to the flow of time. Tidus charged the creature, ducking another strike from its tongue. He grabbed onto its arm and pulled himself up, slicing into a row of 6 red eyes. They popped, bursting with a spray of red liquid, some substance between blood and pus that spurted over him. The creature screeched so loudly it rattled Tidus' teeth, and claws flashed by his face. Tidus twisted out of the way, one claw just catching on his shoulder and flinging him to the ground. Tidus grunted with the impact, then grabbed onto the flow of time, sliding himself back 10 seconds as he jumped to his feet. If he could get behind the creature. No. The void shifter turned to face him, one of the eyes flashing purple and then dimming entirely. Tidus could feel it latched on to his time casting, his slide back through time. Almost like when Helix would grab onto his time casting and stop it. But this creature had hitched a ride instead, like a parasite.
"You fight so furiously, and what for?"
The void shifter hissed at him. Tidus tried to block it out, but the voice didn't just reach his ears. It echoed through his mind itself.
"You don't deserve to live. I can see the truth. So arrogant to believe you had saved your brother. All you did was make him suffer."
Look. Tidus screamed and swung his dagger. He took off one of the long claws with the swipe, and his arms shook. How did this thing know about Kiyun? No, he shouldn't listen to it. It just wanted him to die. Nothing it said mattered, even if it was true. Black ichor dripped onto the ground. Tidus' heart beat madly, forcing a flood of adrenaline through his veins. The void shifter opened its mouth, and Tidus yanked at the flow of time around him. A huge, glowing time mandala appeared around him in the air as he grabbed onto the disgusting time signature of the Void Shifter itself. He grabbed tight and forced it to hold still, forced time to a stop around it. The creature raged against the hold, trying to force its way out of the trap with its own power. Tidus could feel his hold slipping. He had only moments. He darted forward, aiming his dagger for the shifter's neck. The time freeze shattered. The barbed tongue shot out and latched onto Tidus' face, enveloping his entire head in a rubbery grip. Tiny spikes sliced and burned his skin and eyes. Tidus screamed and slashed his dagger to the side, cutting through the tongue enough to weaken its hold, but it didn't let go. Tidus tried to slide back in time to get out of its grip, but the barbs of the tongue dug in, and Tidus could feel himself dragging the creature through time with him. The tongue tightened its hold again, stinging needles digging into his neck, choking off his circulation. The Void Shifter pulled him closer, dragging him by the hold it had on his face and neck, further shredding the skin. Blood and saliva dripped down over his eyes, stinging like acidic tears. He couldn't see. He wasn't sure his eyes would ever work after this. He had to rely on his time sense to get out of the fourth trial alive. He had to kill the Void Shifter. Getting the tongue off his face was not a priority. Instead, he turned his attention to the pulsing, dark core of the creature. It was pulling him within reach. Good. He would let it. As the core of the creature came within arm's reach, Tidus pulled open his connection to the flow of time as wide as it would go and pushed. Time particles around him smelted into panes of glass, shards of reality reflecting 1,000 timelines back at him, so strongly he could see them without his eyes. There. He grabbed at one and pushed his dagger through it. The black shell of the Void Shifter's head burst under his strike. The tongue fell away. He was standing on the creature's shoulders. He had pushed himself into the right version of the future, the version where he was victorious. The cracked exoskeleton spurted black ichor and dark brain matter over his arms. Tidus yanked out the dagger and brought it down again and again and again, until the Void Shifter crumpled to the ground, and its inverted time signature disappeared. Its head was shattered around Tidus like an egg. It was dead, fully, completely. Tidus stumbled away from the empty shell, his entire body sticky with gore, and tightened his grip on his dagger. He tried to open his eyes, but still couldn't see through whatever the barbed tongue had done to him. Tidus turned back towards the door he had come from, stumbling to reach it, but collapsed to his knees. Something had made its way into his bloodstream. Venom? It was racing through his veins as his heart refused to slow down. His time sense sharpened, but something was wrong. Like his time sense had been infected, like whatever the Void Shifter had done to him was eating away at his time signature, maybe his very soul. Tidus's knees buckled, and he fell forward, catching himself with his hands. He was feet away from the gate. His arms shook with the effort of holding himself up. Maybe he had failed after all. Maybe he had killed it, but it had killed him first, and this was it. He was about to let everything go to waste. And to think, Tidus thought wryly, as the darkness clouded in his mind, that they only faced young Void Shifters during the fourth trial. That thing had barely been above the larval stage. Chapter 38. Tidus could tell he wasn't in his room before he even opened his eyes. He could feel it, his connection to the time flow buzzing through him on high alert. He wasn't in a room he recognized at all, but there was the distinct time signature of someone near him that was familiar. He couldn't put a name to them, but he'd definitely been around them before. His entire body ached, like he was recovering from a severe flu. and his face stung like his skin was too tight, like it had blistered from intense heat. The memory of the barbed tongue wrapping around his face, shredding it to pieces, flashed through his mind, and Tidus groaned. He held his breath and opened his eyes. Then he blinked, trying to clear his vision. The world around him was blurry, like looking through a rain-streaked window. Tidus swallowed a lump in his throat. He was lucky he could see at all. He kicked up his time sense, and it filled in the gaps, turning the world around him into a strange patchwork of what he could see and what he could only feel. His vision became something like the view out of a stained glass window, shifting between shades. The ceiling above him was painted with golden time-casting mandalas. He turned his gaze to the other person in the room, and found the clay-skinned, pearly-eyed gaze of one of the savants. He opened his mouth to ask them where he was and what had happened, but he then remembered savants didn't speak, so that would be pointless. Hopefully there was someone else he could ask. "Timothy," Tidus croaked, his voice shockingly brittle. Tidus swallowed painfully. "How long was I out?" He held his breath, waiting for a response. He had never even seen this part of the cathedral before. What if Timothy wasn't accessible here? 7 hours and 32 minutes, Timothy's voice responded after 4 heartbeats. Tidus let out his breath. "You were brought to the recovery sanctum to see if you would recover from your wounds or succumb to them, as is standard procedure after the 4th trial. Congratulations, Tidus. You have passed." "Thank Prometheus," Tidus breathed, relief washing over him. Hearing it said out loud somehow made it real. Not a dream and not a mistake. He had passed the 4th trial. He had survived. "Indeed," Timothy agreed. Tidus pushed himself to sit upright and almost fell off the bed when he was greeted by his reflection from all directions, mirrors paneling the walls. The savant gave an apologetic-looking bow, but Tidus was too distracted by his own appearance to address it. He didn't know where his armor had gone, if it had been salvageable after all that had happened, but he wasn't wearing a shirt at all at this point. That left the new tattoo around his right upper arm and shoulder clearly visible. Gold ink formed an intricate latticework, similar to the one on the gate of the arena, but not identical. He could feel something different about it. The tattoo on his arm, at least, he had expected. The gold lines crisscrossing his face, however, he had not. They spread out from focus points around his eyes and his neck, mingling with the scars from the conduit circle. He reached a hand up to touch them, and flinched. They were tender, like a still-healing wound. Tidus' eyes widened with understanding, his fingers dropping to trace the conduit circle around his neck. They were scars. "Timothy, my face?" Tidus tried to form a coherent question and failed. Scars from an encounter with a void shifter cannot be erased, and the process of granting you the 4th trial tattoo caused this reaction, Timothy explained. Tidus nodded, turning his face to get a better view. It was like his face had cracked, shattering like a ceramic pot, and been put back together with gold. Adding that onto the now complete gold color of his eyes, would his family even recognize him if they saw him again? Of course, it would be better if they didn't, but the thought that Ilaria might not know his face was like being impaled, and Tidus knew exactly what being impaled really felt like. Tidus rolled his shoulders, then leaned off the bed to test putting weight on his feet. His muscles complained, but he was steady. Tidus glanced at the savant, who stood silently watching him from the corner of the room. "I feel all right," Tidus said. It was only kind of a lie. He felt like he could get to his room without collapsing at least. "Can I go?" The savant nodded, then pressed a hand to one of the mirrored walls, and the reflection rippled, then melted away like ice, exposing the familiar architecture of the cathedral's corridors. "Thank you," Tidus said. He returned the savant's bow and left. He realized as the wall closed behind him, he probably could have asked for a shirt. Well, at least he was wearing pants. Tidus was relieved to no longer have his reflection staring at him from every angle, reminding him how much he had changed, declaring to him how far he had come and how much he had lost, all at once. He tried to put his family out of his mind, but every time he blinked, their faces flashed in the darkness. He had taken for granted looking like a part of his family. He had never considered that wouldn't always be the case. No one who didn't know him would guess that he was an Antirrhinum. He no longer looked like his father. Worse, he no longer looked like Kion's brother. It was like every step he took erased another part of his brother, another part of who Tidus used to be. What would be left when he was done? Something better, as he had always believed, or would he be nothing but an empty shell? Tidus clenched his fists and shook his head. He had passed his 4th trial. This should be his greatest moment of triumph. Tidus caught a familiar time signature at the edge of his awareness and smiled. Just what he needed, a distraction. Dasha came around the corner and grinned at him. She had survived her 4th trial the day before. Spider-webbing golden lines laced around her neck, her own souvenir scar. Dasha raised herself on tiptoe and put her arms around Tidus' neck. "I totally thought you were a goner," Dasha said, pressing a kiss onto his neck. Her hand reached up to his face, fingers hovering just above the skin around his eyes, barely brushing the golden scars. "Takes more than that to kill me," Tidus proclaimed with a laugh. "It had you in its mouth, Tidus," Dasha said, her tail poking the small of his back. "But congratulations. The way you killed it was so gross." "That part was not something I enjoyed," Tidus grimaced. "But hey, we both made it." He wrapped an arm around her waist and pulled her closer, whispering in her ear, "We should celebrate." A series of emotions flashed across Dasha's eyes, feelings he recognized since they mirrored his own. The pain of the victory, the first trial they had successfully passed, which they couldn't share it with their families. The desperate hunger to forget that loss. She understood. She was exactly what he needed. "An excellent idea," Dasha breathed, running her hands down his chest, tracing 2 of the conduit runes lightly with the tips of her fingers. "My room's just around the corner." Tidus smiled, and they slipped around the corner and into Dasha's room. He'd never been to her room before, but they didn't waste time with a tour. Dasha was just as desperate for distraction as he was. She cackled when Tidus pulled her down to the bed, running her hand through his hair, down his neck and back. Tidus breathed her scent in deeply, like sandalwood and green tea this time, and always tinged with a hint of sulfur. Her smell, her touch, the taste of her lips, even her presence in the flow of time, tingling and shining. It was all deliciously consuming. It left no room to mourn, no room to remember what he had lost, not even enough time for a breath of guilt. In those moments, she was everything. Tidus woke up slowly, aware at once whose room he was in, of Dasha's warm body curled up next to him, her face resting in the crook of his neck, so that her horns were pointed away from him. Even asleep, Dasha's lips curled into a confident smirk. Tidus wondered what expression he wore when he slept. Most people look younger in sleep, relaxed and innocent, but he didn't see that on Dasha. She was the only Timecaster who had been asleep near him, at least since Helix. Helix had always looked relaxed, but even more so when he had curled up in patches of sunlight for naps. He even snored, a soft thing like a purr. It had always reminded Tidus of a little kid. Tidus blinked to banish the thought. It didn't matter. Helix wasn't what he needed. Helix didn't get it. Dasha understood. She knew what this was, and it was nothing in the long run. Just something to pass the time. They would one day be pitted against each other. They couldn't count on this to last. You couldn't count on any relationship lasting if you wanted to survive in the Omni Tempore. It had to mean nothing. The blanket slid off of Dasha's shoulder, so she was only wrapped in the thin sheet. Tidus reached down to pull the blanket up. In the next 4 heartbeats, several things happened. Tidus' hand brushed against Dasha's dagger. It was tucked into the mattress crease, within reach. Dasha's eyes flew open and met his at the same time that she grabbed the dagger. Tidus retracted his hand, his heart hammering, and his own dagger was already in his grip. Dasha grabbed his arm and threw him to the floor, splintering time around her. Tidus pulled at her timecast, freezing it as she leapt at him. The dagger flashed. Tidus splintered time and grabbed her by the forearms, twisting and slamming her against the floor. They landed. Tidus' dagger pressed to her throat, the tip of Dasha's dagger poised to stab into his gut, even as she was pinned to the ground. They both panted. The few split seconds of panic, of deadly combat, racing through Tidus' veins. His heart thudded madly in his chest. He breathed deeply to slow it down, his thoughts piecing together what had just happened. Dasha had felt him touch her dagger. She must have thought in that moment of waking that he was going to take it, or target her, maybe disarm her before he killed her, and she had retaliated immediately with deadly intent. Dasha's expression cleared from the panic of waking up to a perceived mortal threat, and her eyes settled into something morose. She stuck out her lower lip in a pout. Silence settled around them, and neither moved. Nor did they dare look away. Tidus swallowed. Should he explain, apologize? Would anything either of them said matter? "I think we should break up," Tidus said at the same time as Dasha. They still had their daggers poised to kill the other at the first sign of danger. He couldn't bring himself to be the first to move. She would kill him if he gave her the chance. "I won't kill you," Dasha vowed. She swallowed, grimacing against the touch of the blade against her neck. "Count of 3, we both withdraw." Tidus nodded. Dasha counted, and the glimmer of gold in her eyes told him she was doing exactly what he was, checking with foresight to make sure the other didn't betray them. Tidus removed the blade from her throat, and she let her hands drop to her sides, bringing her dagger with them. Tidus sat up, releasing her from the floor. "Well," Dasha said, standing and pulling on her robe, "I guess we always knew it would end like this." "That seems to be the problem," Tidus agreed. Dasha looked away. "Not a great way to unwind, I guess, if we're both so ready to kill each other." Dasha conceded. "I'm sorry." Tidus' apology sounded empty, even though it was true. He wanted to say something more meaningful, but what was there? She was right. They were willing to kill each other, and they had just proven it. "Go," Dasha said, still not looking at him. Her time signature was active, rippling with her power, so she knew where he was and where he would be in the next few seconds. Tidus stood, quickly putting his pants back on, and left. He made it back to his own room without having to interact with any of the others, thank Prometheus for that, and collapsed onto his own bed. His first impulse, even after months without contact, was to tell Ilaria what had happened. It was silly. It wasn't like he had broken up with a real girlfriend. Just a distraction. Someone who agreed their relationship couldn't mean anything. Someone who had just tried to kill him. And all Tidus wanted to do was tell his sister, or anyone. He ached to have someone to talk to, anyone. Everything was easier when you had someone you could feel safe around. Ilaria had no idea how true that statement was when she had said it. She had only been 11 years old, but was wiser than anyone else Tidus knew. Now, there was no one left he felt safe around. Only himself, and unless he was willing to kill himself for a visit to the timescape, that left him completely alone. Tidus stared at the ceiling. How did the Omni Tempore live like this? And they lived for a long time. The final tattoo would slow down his aging. He would age slower than even a high elf. Assuming he passed the final trial, he would outlive everyone he had ever known. Not Tidus' words, whispered through his mind. Would it be worth it if he ended up alone? Chapter 39. Tidus stood outside the west-adjacent building, rechecking the notification on his comm screen. It was still there, just 3 days after his 4th trial. The rank 27 Omni Tempore, alias Linger, had summoned Tidus to meet with him. Tidus had checked the available information about Linger, and found he was heading the investigation into the terrorists, the assassins that had targeted Tidus' first 3 trials. The summons said that Linger wanted to talk to Tidus about some recent developments, but included no details about what those developments were. Nerves crawled in Tidus' gut. The assassins had come after him, but hadn't actually tried to kill him when they'd had the chance. Tidus already suspected they wanted to manipulate him. Did Linger think it had worked? Tidus took a deep breath and walked inside. He resisted the urge to use foresight. He didn't want to give any more reasons for suspicion, if that was already a concern. He only kept up enough of his time sense to get a clear picture of his surroundings. The blurry spots in his vision hadn't faded since the 4th trial. "Tidus Antirrhinum," Linger said, standing by a desk. He was tall, with 2 pairs of arms. The lower pair was crossed over his middle. The upper pair held a comm screen with a file open. "Please, have a seat." Tidus nodded and slid into the chair indicated. He clasped his hands on the table to keep them from fidgeting, and met Linger's gaze. His real name was Vincis Ernaf, according to the records Tidus had found, but he used the alias Linger more often, so it would be safer to go with that. "As you may be aware, I am heading the investigation into the terrorist group that has been targeting our training," Linger said. "I need to speak with you about some recent developments." Tidus nodded and cleared his throat. "Of course," he answered. "I'm glad to hear there are developments." He bit back more of a response. There was no need for him to ask why he was needed. Linger would tell him. He couldn't let himself seem uneasy, not if he was already under scrutiny. Linger was silent for a moment longer, staring at Tidus with a steely gaze. Reading Linger's file had done nothing to help Tidus interpret the man's expressions or body language. What was it in his eyes? Disapproval? Suspicion? Maybe Tidus hadn't given a thorough enough report, and he was about to be lectured for it. But if that was the case, what could he have left out? "As I understand it," Linger said, breaking the silence, "when you first discovered your time-casting abilities, it was triggered by your death at the Cybermed lab bombing." Linger scrolled through the file on his comm screen, no longer looking at Tidus while he spoke. "Tell me everything you remember about that." Tidus frowned. That was before his training had even started. "I thought this was about—" "Answer the question, Antirrhinum," Linger snapped. Tidus shut his mouth and nodded, the spike of worry growing in his gut. He had been combing through the details of his training, the trials. He hadn't even thought about the explosion at the lab in years. "Wait, did you say bombing?" Tidus asked. Linger raised an eyebrow at him, and Tidus quickly went on. "I'm sorry, I will tell you everything I remember. I just... didn't know it was a bombing at the time. Sorry, I was just surprised. Tidus took a deep breath and held in his questions as he got started. He didn't inquire how long they had known it was a bombing. He detailed the day, including how he had found out about his upcoming university board presentation. Thinking about Kyun, still his ally, still his friend, still alive, sent a horrible jolt through him. Tidus pushed down the pain and pressed on. He went over the family's travel to the university, how Kyun had started his speech to introduce the lab, then the fire. It was chaos, Tidus said. He swallowed the memory of smoke filling his lungs. There was no way to get out. Tidus stopped and took a shuddering breath. It hadn't been an accident. Linger had called it a bombing. His family hadn't just died that day. They had been murdered. Nothing seemed out of place before that, Tidus continued, his voice shaking. He had been working so hard on not thinking about his family, on being okay without them, on being fine on his own. Now, not only did he have to think about them, but he was forced to revisit the sounds of their dying screams. When I reset the timeline, the first time, we diverted the shuttle to stay away, and we couldn't get in direct contact with the university. Something interfered with communication. At the time, I didn't wonder about that much. Linger had been taking notes this entire time, and at this point he set down the comm screen and slid it towards Tidus. Do you recall seeing this symbol anywhere? Tidus picked up the screen, then dropped it back on the desk like it had burned him. The symbol on the screen glared up at him, familiar, but not because he had seen it at the bombing. I saw that in my vision, Tidus said, at the third trial when I reached into the singularity. What? Linger frowned and leaned closer. The symbol on the screen was like two offset triangles with a starburst between them. A broken hourglass. There was a lot. It was like hundreds of realities were being poured into my mind. I had just broken through the seal and hadn't figured out how to manage the conduit circle. Tidus scrambled to explain. The details are hard to remember individually, but this symbol, it was everywhere. And I think the shape changer was in the vision, but that's harder to say. Interesting, Linger said, his frown deepening. Have you seen this design anywhere other than those visions? I don't think so. Tidus shook his head. At least, not since then. I would have recognized it. If I saw it before my third trial, it didn't stand out. Linger picked up his comm screen and started flipping through his notes. Tidus shifted in his seat, digging his nails into his own skin to keep himself from panicking. May I ask, does this mean the bombing at the university? Tidus, Linger cut him off. Due to the content of those visions, I am going to bring you in closer to this investigation. You may be more connected already than you even know, so I want to keep you close. The information I am about to share with you is entirely confidential. Of course, Tidus agreed. We have an agent who has infiltrated the Arachne Talam directly, Linger said. They have discovered the group that we believe to be responsible for sabotaging the trials is partnered with the Arachne Talam, but technically operates separately. They call themselves the Cascades. The Cascades are also suspected to be responsible for the university bombing, among other destructive attacks against Dothara and the Empire at large. Tidus felt the blood drain from his face, and his heart constricted in his chest. The memory of the shape-changer during his first trial filled his mind, their face melting and reforming into the face of Ilaria. They knew his family. He should have realized it years ago. How had he not seen it sooner? They had killed his family. So these developments, Tidus asked finally, Are you close to tracking them down?
Unfortunately, no. Linger sighed. The Cascades are independent from the Arachnitalam, and they don't share much information with the larger group. Their identities and locations are kept very close to the chest. Our informant is looking for more information, but the Cascades seem to be very careful.
I see, Tidus said. Rage surged through his veins, and he fought to keep his voice level. The Cascades had killed his family. Kiyun's death was because of them. I would like to help in any way I can with this investigation. I know I'm not even ranked yet, but...
Your ranking isn't that far off, Linger said, waving his hand. I'll give you the clearance you need. Keep me informed of any information you remember or come across.
Thank you for your vote of confidence, Tidus stammered. Linger put down the comm screen and looked him in the eye.
You passed the 4th trial just a few days ago, right? Have you gotten the 5th trial debrief yet?
No, Tidus said. Linger nodded.
I'll give it to you now. Save you some time.
Tidus straightened in his seat, his heart pounding.
The 5th trial will require every ounce of skill you have acquired, Linger said. Every part of the Omni Tempore training is designed to give us the strongest, most powerful Timecasters possible to protect the Empire. So for this trial, you have to make sure you are the strongest version of yourself.
Tidus nodded and bit his tongue to keep from interrupting with questions.
You will find an alternate version of yourself, a version of your future, and kill them, Linger explained.
Tidus' heart froze in his chest.
You will bring back the duplicate of your dagger as evidence of your success.
Tidus forced himself to breathe, his mind reeling. He would have to access an alternate timeline, part of his own future, and kill a version of himself, a version with more experience, who had probably killed an alternate self already, to prove that he was the strongest version of himself. The image of not Tidus in the timescape flashed through his mind, but he pushed it away. If he found not Tidus' timeline, he could always go to a different one.
I understand, Tidus said. Good, Linger replied. When you return, you will be a fine addition to the Legion, and once you have a rank, I will add you to the investigation officially. For now, you are dismissed.
Tidus nodded and stood, his legs numb with pins and needles. Thank you, Tidus muttered, bowing before turning to leave. Outside the adjacent building, Tidus opened his comm screen and checked the status of his surviving family. They were safe. For now. Tidus swallowed hard. Ilaria had already been targeted by the Cascades. They had already cost him Kiyun. He wouldn't allow them to take any more. His fingers wrapped around the gold ribbon braid behind his ear. She wouldn't be safe until the Cascades were destroyed, and Tidus would see it done. He had killed himself for her before. What was one more time? Chapter 40. Tidus paced through the North Wing library stacks, scanning through the reports of previous successful 5th trials. This trial was the most daunting one yet, even compared to the Void Shifter. He could expect alternate versions of himself to be just as smart, just as strategic, and they would inevitably have more experience. A future version of himself couldn't kill him. One of the first things they learned about encountering alternate selves was that if a Timecaster killed their own past self, they would die. But that didn't mean killing his future self would be any easier. Many trainees never returned. Rumor had it that every Omni Tempore had at least one past self imprisoned somewhere, like the proverbial skeletons in the closet. You couldn't kill your past self by your own hand, but you could absolutely let them live in captive state until death. or convince them to kill themselves. A Timecaster would only die when their past self died, if they caused it. Only the strongest version of the Timecaster could be allowed a spot among the Omni Tempore. Tidus felt himself falling into an old habit, getting lost in his research, losing track of time, forgetting to eat or sleep as he studied. Helix had first broken him of it, keeping him from spiraling into his studies. Then there had been Dasha. Now it was just Tidus and his research. He finally forced himself to stop. He gave himself a deadline. 2 more days of research and then he had to leave. All the research in the universe couldn't tell him who he would be facing, what version of himself he would find. He already knew as much about himself as he was going to know. Waiting any longer than this was just hiding and wasting time. He needed to pass the 5th trial and earn his rank, so he could find the Cascades. Nothing could be allowed to get in the way of that. He could sense Helix still hanging around the cathedral, frequently just around the corner or on the other side of a bookshelf from him, mirroring the days when Tidus had first arrived at the cathedral, before he had ever let himself talk to Helix at all. But the Olethron never approached or spoke to him. Tidus bristled at the hovering. Helix wasn't the type to spend so much time planning. He should have gone off to start his 5th trial almost immediately. Except he was waiting for Tidus, like he thought Tidus needed someone to watch out for him, like he was weak. Tidus kept his distance from Helix as he scheduled the use of a ship for his trial, and tried to avoid him. Even so, Helix approached the shuttle hangar just as it was Tidus' time to leave. Helix had scheduled to leave for his 5th trial at the same time as Tidus. That wasn't a coincidence of any kind. They sat in silence in the shuttle that took them off Dothara and to the orbital station, where they would get their ships. Tidus closed his eyes in meditation, so he wouldn't even have to look at Helix. But he could still feel the other staring at him the entire way. When they were moments from docking, Helix stood and paused right in front of Tidus. "Good luck," he said. "I don't need luck," Tidus commented, opening his eyes to scowl at Helix. Helix sighed and rolled his eyes. "Yeah, all right. Well, see you on the other side, I guess." Helix didn't wait for a response and left, slipping out through the doors as soon as they were open enough for him to fit through. Tidus stood, watching him go, then left once Helix was out of sight. His scowl deepened as he tried to put the encounter out of his mind. Of course, Helix just had to find him right before he left, to distract him, just when Tidus needed to be focused more than ever. Helix threatened to ruin all of it with just a handful of words. Tidus left the shuttle and scanned the station map on his comm screen. A small green beacon showed where his ship was. It wasn't an Omni Tempore Legion ship. This one was small, expendable. 5th trials failed frequently enough that the Empire wasn't about to waste a first-class ship on one. He was assigned a Morje, standard issue. They were dependable, had stasis pods for longer journeys, and could enter atmospheres directly when needed. The ship itself wasn't formidable by any means, no. There was no heavy artillery or advanced weaponry provided for the 5th trial. Tidus was the big gun for this job. Tidus crossed the station floor until he reached his Morje C1-IM8AR3E-C52. The sleek black body of the ship was accented with the signature gold and white of the Empire, the triple-headed dragon emblazoned on each side and on the rear door. The ship opened at his approach, the entry ramp lowering from its belly, and Tidus took a deep breath as he boarded. He knew how to pilot a ship, but this would be his first solo run, alone, except for the assistant AI. Tidus realized with a pang that, for the first time in 3 years, it wouldn't be Timothy, but a standard-issue Jane AI. Tidus paced the layout of the ship, committing it to memory and fighting a growing wave of nerves. This was his final trial, his final chance to prove he belonged with the Omni Tempore, that he deserved a place in the Angelic Legion. Doubt clawed at his ribs, and he pushed it down. He couldn't afford to entertain that. The only option was success. The only choice was victory. That was the only way to make it all worthwhile, to atone for failing Kiyun, to be not just the strongest version of himself, but the one Ilaria deserved. Tidus went to the largest area the ship had to offer, the cargo bay right inside the airlock. The stasis pod was tucked in one corner, and the walls were lined with packaged supplies, food, medical equipment, ship repair necessities. The floor had a decent amount of space, enough for what Tidus needed to do. He pulled out a tube of paint from the maintenance supplies and carefully painted a time-casting mandala on the floor, concentric circles focusing in as it got smaller. Then he pulled at the time flowing through the paint on the floor, speeding it up so the paint dried in a matter of seconds. Tidus tossed the empty paint tube aside and rubbed his hands together. This would be the most complicated and energy-consuming time-casting he had attempted yet. Once he had located a future version of himself, he would have to take the whole ship with him into an alternate timeline. Tidus sat in the center of the mandala and closed his eyes, opening his mind and connection to the time flow. He focused first on himself, on his own time signature and the ripples he sent out into the universe. Then he sent a signal, like plucking off a piece of his time signature and shooting it out into the vastness of time to seek out another version of himself. He took a deep breath, gathering his power to punch it through to other timelines. Before he could muster up the necessary energy, a ping flashed. Another version of himself had been located, and they weren't in another timeline at all. Tidus frowned, focusing on the signal. It was far away, on a planet in another system, but definitely still the same timeline. A future version of himself was existing concurrently. That couldn't be right. Why would a future version of himself be in this timeline? A past version might potentially be here to kill him, but a future version had nothing to gain. Not to mention they were hiding out on what appeared to be a nearly unpopulated planet. Tidus focused in on the alternate Tidus time signature and pushed his energy into marking a beacon so he wouldn't lose track of them. At least he would know if they left the timeline. Maybe they were here on accident. The thought felt overly optimistic, but it would at least explain what was going on. Tidus opened his eyes and stood, letting the power pulsing through the mandala fade as he pulled back on his power output. It faded to his most basic radar, filling in the gaps in his vision. He went to the cockpit and pulled up the coordinates for the planet he needed to reach. Mistrin, a planet 2 star systems away. It had been an early addition to the Empire, mined for its mineral resources, and now lay almost unused. All used up centuries before, deserted, except for the occasional scavenger, hermit, or, apparently, Tidus Antirrhinum. Chapter 41. The stasis pod of the Morje lay dormant. Tidus couldn't afford to waste any time. He could sleep on the way back, assuming he made it that far. This was time he could use to prepare. The isolation of space was suffocating. The stasis pod looked more tempting every day, but Tidus pushed forward with his studying. The beacon on his alternate self blinked consistently, never leaving the planet Mistrin in the 6 weeks it took to reach it. It was his only anchor to sanity, his only connection to another living being. And if he was successful, he would be snuffing out that light with his own hands. By the time the planet of Mistrin came within scanning range, Tidus had learned everything the Empire knew about the planet. All known settlements, shantytowns, all of them, and known inhabitants. His name wasn't listed, of course, because if the Empire knew about his other self at all, he would be using an alias. And since the other version of him hadn't left the timeline, he was definitely hiding there on purpose. Mistrin was mostly known to be frequented by criminals. It was the first place to check if a lawbreaker escaped from any of the nearby planets, a common place for undesirables to attempt to lay low. They were close enough now that Tidus could tell his other self was not at any of the known settlements or buildings. He was even more off-grid than the typical inhabitants of Mistrin. "What am I up to?" Tidus muttered. "Nothing good, I bet." Tidus opened the case with the combat armor he had been allotted for the trial. Light and flexible, it was built out of interlocking plates of metal and synth padding for maximum protection while preserving mobility. It had a stealth mode, and its default state was emblazoned with the colors of the Omni Tempore: obsidian, blood, and gold. Strapping the final pauldron over his shoulder, Tidus let out a heavy breath. Today, he would earn the right to wear these colors. The Morje entered orbit around Mistrin, and he activated the ship's stealth mode. It would protect them from basic scanning equipment at the very least, then set course to enter the atmosphere. The surface of Mistrin surrounding where the other Tidus was hiding out appeared desolate. There were tracks of land vehicles and old landing sites, but other than that, nothing. His other self was hiding underground. Tidus altered the scans to go deeper, revealing an underground cave system or bunker of some sort. The exact layout and life signatures were obscured behind a scanner jammer. If it was strong enough to hide from the Morje, then this Tidus was more capable than most criminals on Mistrin, and definitely more dangerous. Tidus landed the Morje a distance away, far enough to be out of range of scanners he reasoned they probably had access to. He wrapped the time particles around himself carefully, pulling a cloak of concealment for himself to pass unseen by even basic time sets. It scattered the time particles around him, blurring his signature to sensors and time. The beacon he had set on his alternate self hadn't left the bunker yet. Tidus double-checked that his dagger was at his hip, even though he could always feel its presence. It was more important now than ever. Without it, he wouldn't be able to kill his other self. The rear door of the Morje lowered, and Tidus activated the stealth mode of his armor before stepping onto the planet's surface. The air around him was quiet, only disturbed by the rustling of wind and the faint chattering of insects. If not for the reach of his time sense, Tidus would never know there was a hideout below the surface here. Now that he was using his own time sense, something no scanner jammer could interfere with, he could feel the layout. It was no natural cave system. It was too orderly and right-angled for that. Besides his alternate self, there were 3 people inside. Tidus sent out a ripple of power through the time particles around him, slowing time to a halt as he approached the entrance to the bunker. Once he allowed time to resume, the security could pick him up. The closer he got, the more likely it became, even with stealth mode active. But so far, even his alternate self hadn't noticed his presence. Good. Tidus found the door and traced his fingers around the edge until he found the keypad. He brushed off the dust that helped in its disguise, then froze. The box was marked with a symbol he recognized. It was disguised, broken up into 3 pieces, so it wasn't obvious. Except that Tidus had spent the last 2 years studying everything he could about the known terrorist organizations. He would recognize the spider symbol of the Arachne Talam anywhere. His alternate self was in an Arachne Talam bunker. Tidus swallowed hard. He pulled at the time flowing through the keypad, so the code for access lit up with the memory of the last person to gain entry. Tidus shielded his visor so his face would be indistinguishable, then entered the code into the keypad. Then he released the time freeze and entered the bunker. No alarm sounded. Tidus frowned. Was it possible the system recognized him? Because his alternate self was allowed access here? Wouldn't his alternate self have thought to set off an alarm if more than one of them was here? Maybe the security system wasn't sophisticated enough to distinguish when there were two of them. Tidus shook his head and checked the position of the other time signatures. No one had reacted to his entry as far as he could sense. Tidus focused in on the beacon he had set, his target. He would worry about the others when he was finished. The other Tidus was alone. Tidus unsheathed his dagger as he silently crept down the hall to where his other self was. The floor sloped downward, and the ceiling hung lower than it was wide, cramped and claustrophobic. Tidus kept his steps slow to keep his boots from dinging against the metal of the floor. Any moment now, his alternate self would sense him, and the fight would be on. Tidus approached an open door, his beacon just inside. He could see his older self, lounging in a swivel chair, switching between various computer screens. Tidus tensed. There was no way he had gotten this close without being noticed. Nobody ever got this close to him without catching his attention. Unless his other self didn't have the conduit circle. Maybe he couldn't sense the disturbances in time like Tidus could, or bypass the concealment Tidus had put up. Or maybe this other version of himself was a pushover. A hopeful part of Tidus chimed in. Maybe this wouldn't be as hard as he thought. The chair spun around, and he locked eyes with his other self. The eyes were gold, but the tattoos reaching up his neck and peeking out from his sleeves were distinctive. They sent a chill through Tidus. He had seen them before, and not on his own skin. Then the older Tidus opened his mouth and spoke. "Hey, kid," he said with horrible familiarity. "Didn't expect to see you here so soon." "It's you," Tidus responded stupidly, staring at the older version of himself. The same version of himself he had encountered so many times in the timescape. The same one who had given him advice, had been his mentor throughout his training, who had told him how to save his family. What? Why are you here? The other Tidus frowned, eyes flicking to the dagger in Tidus' grip. "Oh, I see." His voice tinged with sorrow. "You're here to kill me?" "What did you think? I was here to join you?" Tidus shot back. To his shock, the other Tidus shrugged. "I did hope I had started to get through to you," he admitted with a sigh. "What?" Tidus breathed. He almost took a step back but caught himself, standing his ground. "I don't understand." "No kidding," Not Tidus said. He reached up to rub his eyes wearily, and the sleeve of his shirt slid down to his elbow, revealing a crimson tattoo Tidus hadn't seen before. 2 offset triangles, a broken hourglass. Tidus felt his chest constrict. He couldn't get a full breath of air. The symbol flashed through his mind. The visions. The cascades. The bombing. "It was you," Tidus said softly. Horror and rage trickled out of his heart and into his bloodstream. Everything started to fall into place. This version of himself, this future Tidus, had been waiting for him in the timescape the first time he had died, after the bombing executed by the Cascades. The shape-changer had killed him, knowing it wouldn't be permanent, knowing they were sending him into the timescape where, once again, this other version of himself had been waiting. The shape-changer hadn't tried to kill him at all during his 3rd trial. Instead, they had talked to him. They weren't trying to kill him. They had never been trying to kill him. They had been trying to corrupt him, and they believed they could because another version of himself was already a traitor. "You
killed my family, Tidus growled. Not Tidus winced at that. They're not dead, remember? He said. Well, most of them. Rage flashed through Tidus, taking up every inch of his body. You killed them. Kyun is dead because of you, he yelled. I tried to save him, but I never would have had to if it weren't for you. You what? You thought I would join you? That I would never find out what you'd done, that I would betray the Empire, everything I've worked for, just because you had a few chats with me about, what was it again? A very particular future you're so invested in. I can explain, the other treasonous version of himself said, still infuriatingly calm. Really, I'll tell you. Just put away the knife. Tidus gripped his dagger more tightly. This was himself he was up against. He had always been good at making plans, at using words. He couldn't let his traitor self talk him into becoming a traitor too. He couldn't let his guard down, and let not Tidus, Arachne Talam friends, kill him. Tears burned in Tidus' eyes, and he didn't bother hiding them or wiping them away. They didn't obscure his vision any further than the scars from the Void Shifter did. Not Tidus reached for a control pad next to him, and Tidus lunged. He pulled at the flow of time, splintering realities around him and slicing at the alternate Tidus arm. Blood spilled. Not Tidus pulled out his own dagger and jumped back into a defensive stance. Tidus wasn't about to give him a chance to do any more talking. Hey, just listen. Not Tidus urged. Why? So you can talk me into suicide? Is that what you're after? Tidus snarled, lunging with his dagger again. What? Not Tidus exclaimed, eyes widening. Tidus didn't buy it. His alternate self couldn't kill him, not directly, but if he got Tidus to kill himself, that would solve a lot of problems for him. No, why would I? I would never do that. Why not? You did it to Kyun! Tidus screamed, his voice cracking. Not Tidus, the traitor Tidus, was everything he hated. Everything about himself he had tried to destroy. Every weakness, every doubt, the other Tidus had given in to it all. He had failed, a version of himself that should never have existed. Weak, a coward, a traitor. The other Tidus had killed his family, willingly, intentionally. He made it impossible for Tidus to protect them, no matter what he did. Tidus gave himself over to his instincts, rage screaming through his veins, and attacked. His alternate self might be older, but Tidus was stronger. His other self was a failure in so many ways. Even his conduit circle had failed. So when it came to raw power, Tidus had it all. You were right about one thing at least, Tidus growled. I am nobody's puppet, least of all yours. He smashed through the defense his other self put up, shattering it as easily as blowing out a candle, and sank his dagger into his other self's neck. Chapter 42. Tidus stood, trembling and dripping with blood, over the body of his other self, the version of himself that had betrayed everything he held dear, who had killed his family in a vain attempt to turn Tidus traitor as well. Tidus clutched his arm to the wound in his side and focused on pulling the flow of time back through the wound, sewing it back together with lightning bolts of pain. Every word his other self and the shape-changer had ever said to him rang through his mind. He couldn't turn it off, couldn't block it out. It was there, showing him every moment that he could have noticed what was going on. Every clue he had seen but had been too blind, too arrogant to understand. Every time he had failed. Last time he had seen his other self before this time. The last time he had been to the timescape, the older version had seemed so disappointed. Tidus pushed that thought away with disgust. The opinion of this dead man meant nothing to him.
He picked up the gold dagger, the symbol of his victory, and sheathed it next to his own. It was familiar, its signature so similar to his own dagger, but tainted, slimy, wrong. Tidus took a shuddering breath and turned back towards the entrance to the bunker. Alarms were blaring. Boots pounded on the floor, running towards him. Tidus threw out a surge of power, freezing time in the entire bunker, and walked over to the computers his other self had been working at. He pulled out a data file from a compartment in his armor and plugged it in. He would drain every drop of information from this bunker. If any Cascade members were here, he would kill them. And he would find the rest. He would find them all and kill them. Tidus allowed the time around the computers to pass at normal speed, while he held the other people down the hall frozen in place. He scanned through the information and scowled. No one else here was one of the Cascades. They were direct members of the Arachne Talam. So he wouldn't kill them. They would talk. Tidus sent out a signal to the nearest Imperial forces, and then sent a message to Linger. "I found one of the Cascades," he said. "It was me, an alternate version of me. I've completed the 5th trial. I am handing over his Arachne Talam associates to the local forces for questioning. I will bring the information I was able to gather from their base directly to you." Tidus walked into view of the Arachne Talam members and allowed time to resume, releasing his hold. They shouted in alarm when they saw him. Tidus slammed them to the ground, knocking them unconscious. Tidus grabbed each of them by the collars of their shirts and dragged them to his ship one by one, throwing them into the Morjay's holding cell. The Imperial forces arrived within the hour, equipped with void engines to bypass the distance more quickly, and Tidus handed off the prisoners. Alone, the blood covering his hands and face itched, sticky and cold. Tidus shed the bloody armor and scrubbed. He was covered in his own blood. It was all his blood, wasn't it? Even the version of himself that was a traitor was still a version of him. How could that happen? What could have made him abandon his faith? How close was Tidus to becoming that version of himself? How could he have trusted and confided in someone so willing to destroy the Empire? How could he ever believe himself worthy of a place in the angelic legions, if that was the person he was capable of becoming? After an hour of scrubbing his skin, it still felt tainted, dirty, stained. Every question, every fear, all the memories of pain, they all built up inside Tidus, until he felt ready to explode. He had nowhere to put it all. It was like reaching out and finding only empty air, where before he had found his family, his parents, Kiun and Ilaria, and then Helix. And he had lost all of them. Kiun was dead because of him. He had pushed Helix away. He had cut off his last line of support like a trapped animal chewing off its own leg. And what was he even escaping? Tidus screamed, slamming his fists into the wall. He had survived all 5 of the trials. He had the chance to become a ranked Omni Tempore, one of the greatest honors in the Empire. Now, alone, with his own blood on his hands, it felt hollow. Worse than hollow, it felt like swallowing broken glass. It was shredding him from the inside out. He had reached the peak, only to discover it had never been worth the climb in the first place. Tidus didn't remember activating the stasis pod, but in his daze he must have entered it. He woke to the bland voice of Jane announcing they were hours away from returning to the orbit station above Dothara. Tidus stumbled out of the stasis pod and dressed himself with stiff, mechanical movements. His entire body had been alight with painful emotion before entering stasis, and now the entire world around him felt muffled, numb, meaningless. Everything seemed meaningless. Tidus hung both daggers at his hip and stood by the Morjay's door. When it opened, he didn't leave. He leaned against the threshold, pressing his forehead to the cold metal and closing his eyes. Death had never seemed so tempting. Not the death he had experienced before, no, but the permanent kind. A real escape. Tidus breathed through his nose, trying to ground himself, when a familiar time signature flashed next to him. "Impressive." Zion's voice sneered, and the other trainee entered Tidus' ship. "I honestly didn't expect you to get this far." "You're an idiot," Tidus grumbled. He didn't have the energy to come up with anything more cutting than that. Besides, the truth in this case was simple. Zion was an idiot. "There's a proverb where I come from," Zion said. "That which you loathe in others is but your reflection in their eyes." Tidus rolled his eyes. "If you're fishing for a congratulations, it's not happening," Tidus said. Then he squinted, scanning Zion more closely. They still only had one dagger. They hadn't completed the 5th trial yet. Tidus smiled wanly. "Oh, I see. Nothing to congratulate anyway." Zion snarled and lunged at him. Tidus jumped back, fumbling for his own dagger. His fingers were stiff and uncooperative. He cursed. He should have been on guard. Zion had been itching to kill him since they'd first met. If he was going to die, it was definitely not going to be by this moron's hand. Tidus stumbled back and fell. Zion's blade was inches from stabbing straight through his heart when Tidus felt a tug. It was familiar. He'd felt this time-casting before. He blinked and was 3 feet away, watching as Helix grunted. Zion's dagger had buried itself deep into the Oletheron's chest. Zion's eyes narrowed, and they turned back to Tidus, pulling out the dagger and ignoring Helix as he slumped to the ground, blood pooling underneath him. Tidus' heart thudded. Helix had saved him. "I guess it's my lucky day," Zion snarled. "I get to kill both of you." Chapter 43. Tidus watched as Helix's time signature flickered, then faded, and his body went still. Dead. Zion spun their dagger in their hand and grinned viciously at Tidus. A pressure built up inside Tidus, a force, until it exploded into a scream and everything around him froze. Time stuttered to a halt, and Tidus realized he was still screaming. Helix was dead. The only thing Tidus had left was dead. He could never see his family again, but Helix had always been there, no matter how hard Tidus had tried to push him away, and now he was gone. Tidus screamed and leapt at Zion. His hold on the time freeze slipped just in time for Zion to raise their own dagger in defense, but Tidus knocked it away. A bright flash of light would have blinded Tidus if he still relied solely on his physical eyes. The silvery starburst barrier pushed him backwards, away from Zion. The Astron grinned, licking Helix's blood from their blade. Tidus' veins burned. He reached out and grabbed onto Zion's time signature and pulled, yanking the starburst barrier from their grasp. Zion screamed, eyes going feral, as the barrier vanished, and they leapt wildly at Tidus. He ignored the searing pain as the blade sliced his arm open, stabbed his own dagger into Zion's eye, shattering the magenta lens of their glasses, and twisted. No, he realized. Not his dagger. Not Tidus' dagger. That was fitting. Zion didn't deserve to die by Tidus' own blade. The weapon of a traitor would suffice. Zion screamed, their body spasming. Tidus pulled out the dagger and brought it down again. Zion crumpled, and Tidus landed with his knees on their chest, bringing down the knife again. 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 Just like when he had killed the Void Shifter, until Zion was a shredded mess of blood beneath him. Drenched in gore, Tidus stumbled to Helix's body. still warm and lying in his own blood. Tidus' hands trembled as he rolled Helix over to see his face. His golden eyes were empty, vacant, staring into nothingness. He was gone, and he wouldn't come back, not the way Zion had killed him. Tidus gripped Helix's body tightly, tears streaking down his face. No, he couldn't accept that, wouldn't accept that. There was one way Helix could be brought back, maybe. Either that, or they would both end up dead. Tidus had studied all the uses of runes and mandalas and rituals, everything he could get his hands on. He had found no record of this being done, but in theory, it could work. Tidus stood, entire body trembling, the coppery taste of blood on his tongue. He dragged Helix's body out of the entrance into the cargo hold, where the concentric mandalas were still painted on the floor. His breath hitched with sobs, and he bit his cheek to keep himself grounded. This had to work. He had to get it right. He could do this. He would do this. Or he would die with one more failure added to his name. Tidus placed Helix in the center of the mandalas, then took his own dagger from his hip. The traitor's blade wouldn't be involved with this. He dipped his dagger into the bloody wound in Helix's chest. Using the blood like ink, he added runes to Helix's forehead and hands, then onto his own body. Something like this must have been the way his alternate self had joined him in the timescape. He wouldn't have needed Tidus' blood because they had the same blood, and Tidus had never been killed with a Timecaster's blade. Tidus gripped his dagger in his hand. It was all or nothing. This was the only way there would even be a chance. Tidus had to kill himself the same way Helix had died, if they were going to get into the same timescape. It would only work if Tidus had remembered the ritual perfectly, if all of his runes were exact, if Helix even wanted to come back. If any of those things weren't true, they would both die here. It would all be over. Tidus took a deep breath and checked over the runes one last time. It didn't matter that he would die here if he failed. He couldn't continue on with all this without Helix. He refused to. Tidus gently closed his friend's eyes, then pressed his dagger to his own breast. He adjusted his grip, steeling himself, and plunged the dagger into his heart. Pain blossomed in his chest, his blood pouring out like a fountain and mixing with Helix's. Tidus pulled at the flow of time around them as the mandalas swirled to life and hummed with power. He anchored them to this day, before anyone had been killed. The mandalas around him blazed with blinding light. The very air glittered with time particles, burning like microscopic suns. Tidus' heart stopped beating, and he slumped forward, darkness overtaking him. For the first time, Tidus woke up in the timescape shivering with a deep chill. Was that from the blood loss? He shook his head and got to his feet. No, it was the wind. There had never been wind before. It had always been eerily still in the timescape. Now the turbulent air sent time particles biting into his skin and eyes. "Helix!" Tidus called out, shielding his eyes from the whipping gale. Tidus squinted through the not sandstorm and spotted a figure, hunched over like they were kneeling. "Helix!" Tidus tried to run towards him, but the wind buffeted him back, and the sand pulled his feet deeper with every step. "Helix, please, I'm sorry." The sand pulled him in until he was wading, time particles swarming up to his waist. Finally, the figure turned around. It was Helix, but smaller, younger than Tidus had ever known him. He was just a child, not even wearing the time-casting clothes that Tidus had always seen him in. He was dressed in traditional Oletheron clothing, pulling his thin cloak up over his head, like a child hiding from shadows after a nightmare. His amber eyes were wide and fearful, his entire body trembling. Tidus had once asked his other self about what they looked like in the timescape. His other self said it was how they saw themselves, or how they felt about themselves. Tidus realized that, for the first time, he wasn't wearing the Omni Tempore robes in the timescape. Instead, he wore the familiar desert cloak and leggings for riding sand skimmers. The tiny form of Helix shook with sobs. A lump rose in Tidus' throat, guilt threatening to drown him even faster than the sand. Helix looked so small, so scared, and so horribly alone. And it was Tidus' fault. "Helix," he called again, his voice cracking. "It's okay. I'm here. I won't leave you again." The small figure of Helix stared at him, then ran towards him. He slammed into Tidus' chest full force, knocking Tidus on his back. Tidus wrapped his arms around the diminutive figure and closed his eyes. The sand didn't swallow him up when he fell. Instead, the wind stilled, and he found himself once again sitting on the surface of the ground. Tidus opened his eyes and sat up, hugging the small, trembling Helix. "I'm sorry I left you," Tidus murmured. What could he say? That he had been so afraid that he had mistaken Helix for a threat? He had been so self-absorbed he couldn't let Helix help him? It was all just excuses. Helix had never made excuses. Helix had never left him. He had followed through on their promise to stick by each other. "I'm sorry," Tidus said again, tears streaming from his eyes. "I thought I had to do it all alone, but I was wrong. Ilaria was right. You were right. I can't, and I don't want to. I don't want to do any of it without you." "What are you doing here?" Helix rasped. He wrapped his arms around Tidus' neck. Tidus blinked, and Helix was his normal size, closer to looking his real age, sitting next to Tidus with his arms still around his neck and his forehead pressed to Tidus' shoulder. "I was trying to save you. You're not supposed to be dead." "I came for you," Tidus said. We can go back. If it worked, and I think it worked, then we can go back." Helix raised his head and looked into Tidus' eyes. The look Tidus saw there sent a shiver through him. Helix's eyes were hollow, mournful, almost as dead now as they had been when Tidus had closed them before the ritual. "Did you really mean it?" Helix asked. "Yes, we can go back," Tidus said, gripping his friend's arms tightly. "I studied the rituals, the runes. We can go back. We can fix this." "No," Helix spoke sharply, baring his fangs. "Did you mean it when you said you won't leave me?" Helix looked away, pulling his hands away from Tidus and rubbing his palms over his eyes. "Look, I know you've always been motivated or whatever," Helix continued. "I get it, but I've already been alone long enough. I'm not interested in living like that anymore. The Empire will get along fine without me." Tidus bit his lip, then reached out a hand to Helix's shoulder. Guilt washed over him in waves. Helix had never turned his back on him, even when Tidus had thrown him away so easily. The shame burned like acid in his gut. "I meant it," he said softly. "I'm sorry I didn't realize it sooner, but I meant it, that I don't want to do any of it alone. The Empire can get along fine without either of us, or with both of us, because I won't get along fine without you. I don't want to go back without you." Helix turned back to look at Tidus, his eyes no longer dead, but instead pained, shattered. "Then maybe we should just go," Helix suggested. "Maybe we don't return to the Timecasters or the cathedral. Maybe we go to the Gilded Halls instead. We don't have to live like them. We'll always be... The other Omni Tempore will always be trying to kill us. What if one of us
It won't ever end, Tidus. Tidus looked away this time. Why was he trying to bring Helix back? His family was already dead, waiting for him in the Emperor's light. And Helix was right. The other Omni Tempore would always be a threat. There would always be people trying to kill them, and Tidus didn't want to face that without Helix. But the thought of choosing death, of leaving, was like an implosion in his lungs. Ilaria was still out there, alive, even if he could never see her. And so were the Cascades. He couldn't abandon her. I get it, Helix, Tidus said. My family, Ilaria, she's in danger too. If you don't want to go back, I won't ask it of you. I don't deserve to ask anything of you. I know that. Hey, Helix punched him in the shoulder. Tidus looked up and blinked. Helix gave him a sad smile, one ear drooping down. It's not about what you deserve. My family can't be hurt anymore. They're fine. Yours isn't. So okay. We go back. Tidus swallowed, pain and fresh guilt at forcing Helix back into a life of constant danger flooding his body. It was selfish of him, even if he wasn't exactly asking Helix. It felt like a manipulation. Whatever Helix said, he couldn't ignore how unearned the offer of help was. How much Helix didn't owe him this kind of sacrifice. But Helix had made up his mind. Tidus couldn't change that. He really didn't want to go back without him, if his friend was willing to come. And maybe Tidus would never deserve it. He pulled Helix forward and wrapped him in a hug. Helix froze, then relaxed and hugged him back. His tail curled around Tidus' wrist in a comforting, familiar, fluffy hug. Tidus had missed that more than he missed air when he was drowning. I'm so sorry, Tidus whispered. I know, Helix said. I'm just glad to have you back. Tidus closed his eyes and drank in the feeling of this moment, or not moment, since they were in the timescape. He would never deserve Helix. He could never earn the kind of loyalty Helix had for him. But he would never stop trying either. Hey, what do I look like? In here? Tidus asked as they released each other from the hug. Helix leaned back to examine him. Well, your sick face scars are gone, Helix said, and your eyes are red again. Still got the tattoos and the conduit circle. Other than that, you just look like you. How about me? Your eyes look different too, Tidus replied. Less gold, more like honey, like when we first met. When I first got here, you looked like a little kid, actually. I was having a mental breakdown. Shut up, Helix said, hitching his shoulders up around his head. Tidus laughed and clapped a hand on Helix's back. I'm not judging. I really missed you. It's good to talk again. Yeah, Helix agreed, his shoulders relaxing. I missed you too. I'm sorry if I said something that, I don't know. You were right, I didn't get it, whatever was up with you. It wasn't your fault, Tidus said. It was stupid, but I was jealous. Because I had to vow to never see my family again, and for you it was just another trial. And I know how awful that makes me sound, because my family is alive still, but... What do you mean? Helix asked, frowning. Tidus swallowed and looked at him. Why can you never see them again? Helix pressed. A fresh wave of horror washed over Tidus as he realized Helix hadn't been insensitive. He hadn't been flippant. Helix didn't know. And who would have told him? He had no family to say goodbye to, so why would he have known? It's the condition of the third trial, Tidus said. After that, we have to. We can't. If we talk to them again or reach out at all, the penalty. Tidus clenched his fists and looked away. They would make me kill them myself if I ever... Helix grabbed Tidus and pulled him into a tight hug. "I'm sorry," he said. "I'm sorry. I had no idea. I didn't. I should have realized. No, I should have just told you what was wrong." Tears escaped from Tidus' eyes. "I'm sorry. Well, this definitely explains why you were so mad at me." Helix forced a smile into his words. "I mean, the way I was acting. If I had known, I would have deserved every word of that." "You didn't know," Tidus said, releasing Helix to wipe at his eyes. "So when we go back," Helix frowned, "will it reset all the way, Zion?" "I'm not sure," Tidus confessed. "They might come back, but, they were very dead when I left, and they weren't part of the ritual, so I'm not sure what'll happen to them." Helix sighed and rolled his shoulders. "I guess we should find out, yeah?" Tidus nodded. "Then we can get started on our first ranks. Together," Helix said with a grin. Tidus nodded. "Together."